I'm sending them to you again, Jason.
All right, thank you. To my Hofstra email, right? Not the other one.
I don't know, Jason. I'll know when I hit the button. Yeah, to Pride.
Yes.
I just sent them again.
Okay, thank you. Oh, it's the same comments that you put in the document.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Then I got them the first time. Thank you.
Yeah. No, one of the reasons, and I think it's an important approach to teaching, and I did this as a secondary school teacher as well. And that is, I try to use student writing as the basis for organizing the lessons. Because in their writing helps the teacher to understand what they think is important and what they don't understand. So, this is the assessment. If we were doing at TPA, this would be the assessment that informs instruction. But also, we have to address student writing skills. I mean, Romello, how much do you focus on writing in your 7th grade class?
I try to do at least one writing assignment per unit. It doesn't always
What
have
kind
to
of
be.
assignments to give them?
At the beginning of the year, we did compare contrast, like two Native American tribes, and later on in the year, I start introducing them to enduring issues because that's what they need.
How much feedback do you give them on it?
My feedback's always extensive. I give them detailed comments, and then I do like one general overall comment at the end. I do that both middle school and high school.
Do you address both writing and content, or?
I do address content, grammar, writing, everything, yeah.
That's what we're expected to do. But also, it helps us. That's how we know what they didn't get. A multiple choice, we don't understand what in multiple choice, we don't know what they understand. We don't understand. They just know they got it wrong. But in the essays, we see their thought processes. So that's why I always read. Now, just a quick, in terms of homework, you can't collect and read every homework assignment. You'll go nuts. You'll spend more time on their homework than they spent on it. So on homework, I used to look at it selectively. I used to go up and down the rows and say, I need to see homework 3, 4, and 5 in the unit. And then I would read one question. And if they did that question seriously, I would give them credit for the 3 assignments. And if they did that question like a joke, I'd say, I need to collect yours. So they don't know which of the 12 questions I'm going to read. So at least they do it. But I didn't after a while, I just stopped collecting everything because I would go nuts. I would spend all night reading homework.
Sounds like our final for last semester.
Well, again, the final for last semester was to you're going to figure out your own ways of how you want to approach writing. I mean, Romello, do you collect everything and read?
No.
But you did at the beginning, right?
I just skim their work, and my eyes will catch if something is like way off, and then I might make a comment or mark it wrong, but I skim most of the time.
You have to. What I do is there are 2 different groups that you read carefully. Sometimes kids have real insight and you want to encourage it. And sometimes kids are way off either because they're not trying or they don't get it. So you're looking for flags. A red flag is something that is way off and you understand that they didn't get it. And if you get a bunch of kids with the same red flag, you didn't teach it well. All right, let's get started. I sent you a piece. I know you were very excited that that they found, this was not a new fossil. The fossil was from 1967. What was new is their understanding of the fossil. I want to share the screen so I can just show you the pictures. Where did I put it? There it is.
Alan, can my son say bye because he's gonna go with his dad now? He wanted to say hi to
Oh,
everyone.
say hello to everybody and say goodbye to everybody.
Say hi and bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Good to see you.
See you later. See you later. Okay, all right, go baby.
Okay. You can see the picture. I sent it to you earlier. The picture on the right is a reconstruction of the skull. Now, they don't find they didn't find skulls, they found bone fragments. But the dark part, that's the actual bone. And the white part is plaster of Paris that's holding the bone together. But the skull, this could be Chris Heilig's skull. It's our skull. Not necessarily Chris's skull, but you get the point, Chris. All right, could be my skull. But it's the shape, but what happens is that, again, they found fragments, they put it together. They tried to use radioactive carbon dating, because what happens is, does anybody know how carbon dating works? Carbon dating? All right. There are radioactive isotopes, are basically all the minerals, oxygen, carbon. And they tend to be, in living things, the ratio of standard carbon, I think it's carbon 14, and radioactive carbon, carbon 16, is steady. However, once the living thing is no longer living, it's no longer producing more carbon. So what happens is that since the carbon that's radioactive decays, over time, the ratio of standard carbon to radioactive carbon changes. So because they know the rate of decay of radioactive carbon, they can use that to say how long ago that ceased to be a living thing. And what they had estimated is that this animal died about 190,000 years ago in Ethiopia, in southwestern Ethiopia along the Omo River. But using carbon, that was the best estimate they came up with. Now that made it one of the oldest human-like fossils. Humanoid includes our ancestors and our cousins, but human means that animal was like us. Well, what happened was they found the skull in 1967, but new teams have been exploring the region, and they came up with a new way of measuring how old it is. Instead of looking at the bones itself, they looked at the layer of rock, and you can see all the rock layers there in that region. Now, this is a region of repeated volcanic activity and volcanic ash. It's quite possible that this person was encased in volcanic ash. What happens is that different volcanic eruptions have different chemical mixtures. They now realize that the volcanic level this person was buried in dated from 233,000 years ago. What that does is it pushes the age of our species back by 36,000 years. So instead of our species emerging in Africa at 197,000 years ago, it now appears to have emerged 233,000 years ago. Now, I got to be honest, the 36,000 years don't make that big difference to me. But what's more important to me are two things. One, that they developed new techniques for measuring. But two, and this is what Harris is arguing, Diamond is arguing, and this is what all scientists argue, that your explanations, your theories must be consistent with the data. And because they have new data, they had to change their understanding, our understanding of the age of the human species. So in science and in a scientific approach to history and social science, we have to be prepared to change our explanation based on evidence. And that's a big thing we're teaching kids, that their ideas must be based on evidence. That's how science works, and that's how history works. Any thoughts or comments? Okay, Jason.
I was just going to say that I saw this thing the other day that said one of the best things a teacher ever did for me was I asked them a question and they didn't know the answer. So they went and researched it and got back to me. And I think that is in line with what you're saying, because it teaches students that it's okay to not know something and that finding the facts and the information that's correct will better suit you.
But we're not the encyclopedia, we're not Wikipedia. But I would say it a little differently, because sometimes students in class would raise points. And I would say it's a very good point. But rather than me answering that, let's you and me and anybody else see if we can find the answer and we can make it part of a lesson. One, if you don't know the answer, that gives you time to figure it out. But it's more important if it's an important question to introduce, to make time to teach it. So that's what I try to do. And Chris wants me to record.
Recording in progress.
Thank you. What I figured out, Chris, is I'm recording on my laptop rather than my desktop, because remember, that's why we froze the other day. Too many things were open. I'd like, unless there are other questions, I'd like to really just get started on people presenting. Chris Grau, we're going to start with you, and then Chris Heilig, and then we'll see where we are. Chris Grau, take it away.
So I covered chapter 8 alone because there was a lot of information there. So I'll try to keep it as brief but as effective as possible. So the chapter is called Apples or Indians. And the first question that Diamond is trying to approach is when we're talking about agriculture and its importance to the Fertile Crescent and how it emanated out of the Fertile Crescent and allowed people to specialize and send societies onto their journey towards gun, germs, and steel. He talks about essentially why the Fertile Crescent, why did it happen in the Fertile Crescent specifically? The Fertile Crescent has a Mediterranean climate, but that climate's present also in California and Chile. So why didn't agriculture arise independently there as it did in the Fertile Crescent at the time that it happened in the Fertile Crescent? So he first says that the benefit of the Fertile Crescent is one, that the crops there were very productive and were very high yielding. He calls them annuals. I think that's actually the botanical term. So basically, because the climate of the Fertile Crescent had a long dry season, but also wet winters, the plants in that region adapted to devote all of their energy into creating these big seeds that were able to lie dormant while the rest of the plant died during the dry climate, and were able to then be stored by humans for longer periods. And these crops like barley and wheat, they're also high in protein, whereas crops or the wild answers, at least of the crops we have now from North America, from areas outside of Eurasia, they weren't as high in protein, they weren't as nutritious. So that's one of the reasons he says the Fertile Crescent was an advantageous place for it to be in. So the second one is that not only were these crops high yielding, but they were also highly abundant in the wild. So there was just, because Eurasia and because that Fertile Crescent area is the biggest Mediterranean zone that exists on Earth, it had a high variety and a high abundance of wild plants and animals to be domesticated, more so than in California, in Chile, or anywhere outside of Eurasia. He gives an example about the wild ancestor of corn. I think it's called teosint in North America. And he basically said the corn that we know now looks far different from its wild ancestor. And he attributes that to the fact that a lot of the wild ancestors of plants found in the Fertile Crescent, they didn't need much change. So they were easier to be domesticated. And because they were so stable, we didn't need to wait thousands of years for it to adapt to the crop for our benefit. And that wasn't the case with corn. And that's why agriculture, in part, was delayed in North America and in places outside of Eurasia. And the third reason, he says that a lot of the plants in the Fertile Crescent, so this is where I was a little confused because it did get very heavily focused on botany, but I think he was saying that they're known as self-pollinating helpers. These plants are able to self-pollinate, whereas other plants outside of Eurasia have to cross-pollinate with other plants. So self-pollinating plants, I think, are more helpful to humans, especially when we're trying to domesticate them, because they're more predictable in a way. And we're, I think, better able to work with them, or better able to mold the way that we derive benefit from them. I think that's what he was saying. And so the Fertile Crescent in that Southwest Asia region has a lot of self-pollinating plants. So then the next question he addresses is, again, why agriculture rise independently in the Fertile Crescent when similar climates exist elsewhere in the world. And so he identifies 5 advantages that the Fertile Crescent has over Mediterranean climates in, let's say, California. The first one is, again, that it's the largest Mediterranean zone on planet Earth. And this meant that there was a wide variety of wild plants and wild animals that could be domesticated. I think he says of the plants available on Earth, there are like 200,000 different species of plants. Only a few thousand of them are actually eaten by humans. So basically, when you look at the Fertile Crescent, there's a larger sample size of plants and animals to be domesticated. The second advantage, he says, is climate variation. The Fertile Crescent experiences a wide range of different climates, which I think there was actually a page missing or a section missing, but I think he attributes that to why there's such a high yield crop and why the crops there were so abundant and productive. The third advantage is that the Fertile Crescent has a diverse topography. There are areas of high elevation, there's lowlands, there's plains, there's areas of dryness, there's areas of wetness, and that obviously attracts, again, a whole wide variety of different plants and animals that might not exist in smaller and less diverse topographies in California and Chile, outside of Eurasia. The fourth advantage was that he calls it the founder package, or the crop package, meaning the crops that came out of the Fertile Crescent. Again, they were very nutritious. So, for example, he says there were 3 cereals that served as the carb source. There were 4 pulses, a different kind of, I think it's a grain that was high in protein that wasn't found anywhere else outside of the Fertile Crescent. And then you had the 4 staple domestic animals that we have today: the cattle, the sheep, the goat, and the pig were all indigenous to the Fertile Crescent, whereas no other large mammal outside of the dog was available outside of the Fertile Crescent. So that was a huge advantage. And number 5, let's see, he says that there was less competition. So less competition from hunter-gathering lifestyle than for agriculture. So one of the main protein sources or animals that was hunted in the Fertile Crescent was the gazelle. And after a while, as population densities increased and humans became more skilled hunters, the gazelle became overexploited. So it became the benefit of following a more agricultural and sedentary lifestyle was far easier to adapt, because there really was no other choice than it was maybe outside of the Fertile Crescent. And then he ends the chapter by talking about the title of the chapter, Apples or Indians. He wants to point out that it's not that certain humans are innately unwilling or unable to live in an advanced and agricultural society. So thus the problem doesn't lie with the Indian, but at the same time, it doesn't lie with the apple. There are certain plants that just were harder to domesticate. And he talks about the apple in the sense that the apple exists in North America, but it took a lot of grafting techniques. And I think those techniques are very complicated. Domesticating the apple took those grafting techniques that people just didn't know back then in order to domesticate the apple. So I think he's trying to make the point that, again, it's not people that are innately unwilling or unable to live in an advanced society, nor is it the plants and animals are just impossible to domesticate. It's that the environment and what people lived with is what influenced how much they farm.
Versus self-pollination. Does anybody think they could explain that? Because Chris was a little bit unsure how it worked. Jason, Jason.
Do you mean like how technically plants are also male, female, and so
Yeah.
self-pollination is where a plant can pollinate itself? Basically, like you take each part and put it together, like the pollen from each, which allows the plant to flower and reproduce. But if
Yeah.
it's not self-pollinating, then it needs a bee or a bug. And usually bees are so crucial. And I don't know if everyone knows, how like a few years ago, they're like, bees are going extinct. We're not going to have any food. Well, that's why, because if bees don't pollinate plants, then they're not going to grow.
Right. All plants have both male and female parts, but in some, they evolve so the male and the male and the female parts don't share the reproductive material. In some plants, it's positioned so that it just basically falls off from the male and it impregnates the female. What is the advantage of cross-pollination as opposed to self-pollination? Because you would think that since self-pollination is so easy, why don't all plants just self-pollinate? Chris, Mr. Brown?
I mean, I would guess that you're able to explore different varieties of that plant.
Yes, you get greater biological diversity by sharing genes from different plants than you do if a plant just reproduces itself. If a plant reproduces itself, its offspring is identical to it. And if all the offsprings are identical, if there's a mutation or a problem, it could wipe out the whole species. But if in cross-pollination, you have diverse, different kinds, different aspects, different balances, it means the species has a better chance of survival. In terms of food, the self-pollinators were easier to domesticate than the cross-pollinators because you depended on other natural phenomenon. I think the point you raised about diversity very much has to do with what a factor of different niches, environmental niches. So in an area where there's different elevations, or an area where there's rains here, there's rain on the other side of the hill, you're going to have different environments. You're going to have different crops will dominate. And that happens in the Fertile Crescent. I think Jason asked, well, what do we learn about this for contemporary issues? Well, his point about how plants grow in a very particular niche explains the mass migration into the United States from Central America. One of the things that has happened with climate change is Central America is warming. Now, we're not talking about spectacular warming, but we're talking about narrow warming. Well, this has had a major effect on coffee crop. Coffee grows in a very particular niche. Remember, it starts in Ethiopia, where they also had that niche. Coffee grows in equatorial highlands, hills. It grows in Jamaica, Kenya, Guatemala. Why? Coffee needs hot days and cool nights for the beans to ripen. Well, what's happening now is that because of the warming, you're not getting the cool nights at the old elevation. So people are going up the hill to plant the coffee. But the problem, as you go up the hill, you have less land to grow on. So in nature, crops are very dependent on narrow niches. I don't know if it was Melissa, in your paper, were you talking about the Maori and the other group?
Yeah, the Maori and Mori.
Okay. One of the things that happens in the Pacific Islands is the Pacific Ocean currents and the Pacific winds very much lead to very narrow and different ecological niches, which is why you can get very different tribal customs on different islands. I visited the Galapagos in 1969. And one of the things that was so striking about the Galapagos is you'll have two islands that are neighbors, and one will be a desert and one will be a jungle. And the reason for that is the Galapagos are on the equator, and one island is getting cold Antarctic current, called the Humboldt Current, and the other island is getting warm tropical equatorial currents. So now you didn't get different humans there, cultures, because the humans didn't really settle there, but you get different animal, plant, and animal species there because the currents create different ecological niches. I think Darwin found 24 different types of finches because the plants were so different in each region. And the islands would be right near each other. But you would have islands that were tropical, and then you have a neighboring island that had seals living on it because it had colder water. And the last question, this is not just Chris, and he makes a big point that the Native Americans don't have the geographical conditions to develop civilization. It's an area where I have difficulty because the Mayans do develop a civilization that is at least as sophisticated as the Egyptians and the Sumerians, with writing, with a state, with religion, with math. They die out because of drought, wipes out their agriculture and pits tribes against each other about between 800, about the year 1200. But what's interesting to me about the Mayans in the Yucatan is their civilization, 800 AD, is where China and Egypt were 5,000 years earlier. So the question to me is always, why was their civilization 6,000 years behind Egypt and China? And, I mean, Diamond doesn't address it. Can anybody come up with a possible explanation? Why would the Mayans be 6,000 years behind Egypt and China? Mr. Heilig.
Let's see. One reason I think you talked about briefly last class, I'm going to talk about it because that's one of my chapters. They didn't really have, besides corn, they didn't really have any staple food crops like the Europeans, the Africans, and the Asians. They had rice, they had wheat, barley, oats, all these foods that are easy to grow, and also get into later about how, because of the way the continents were set up, it was easier for the crops in Africa and, well, Afro-Eurasia to spread across.
Okay.
But also the fact that the Mayans.
That's great. That's good one. Let Jenna try a second one. And then if I'll get back to you because I want to spread it out a bit.
Well, I was actually going to say the same thing about how it runs from east to west and the climate is the same throughout. So it's easier for trade to spread throughout as well. So I was going to kind of go off of what Chris said.
Mr. Grau?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. I know Diamond hit upon how like Japan might have a similar, I mean, barring any other topic, like geographical obstacles like the mountains or deserts, but in terms of the climate, if they're at a similar latitude, they'll have a similar climate. Whereas, you know, Yucatan might be further south than areas in the Fertile Crescent. So the agricultural methods or even the ability to grow food might have been tougher because the climate is far different than what you would find in Southwest Asia.
I actually have a slightly different hypothesis. Where did the Native Americans come from? Mr. Grau?
Didn't they cross the Bering Strait originally?
Yes. About 20,000 BC is probably when they crossed it during the last ice age. Now, they didn't walk on the ice, but because North America was largely covered with ice, sea levels were lower, so what are now islands was actually land. Approximately how long did it take them to get from Siberia to Mexico? 10,000 years. I would argue, counter to Diamond, that the problem was not that their civilization was behind. The problem was not necessarily the absence of resource. The problem was they had to walk for 10,000 miles to get there. And that may well be the explanation. Christina?
This is something that was addressed in the chapter that I read, chapter 1, but I still kind of had a question about it. They came from Siberia. How'd they get to Siberia?
Okay, very good.
Mhm.
Did someone else want to address that, Chris? Did you want to address what Christina said?
I mean, I just had another question, just going off of what you said in terms of they needed time to walk. I mean, if you're going back to the fact that all modern humans, I guess, evolved coming out of Africa, I mean, wouldn't it take the same amount of time to walk from Africa to East Asia and anywhere else in the world? I mean, I get that there might be a few thousand years where some people might have arrived in where they are today earlier or later, but in general, it still took time for us to emigrate out of Africa, you know?
Mr. Heilig?
As for why the original native peoples of the Americas came to the Americas from Siberia, well, they were hunter-gatherers, so they were following the food, and the food just so happened to plot across the land bridge. And then they followed the food deeper and deeper south into the continent until it got to the point where the bridge they came off, well, burned for them. And so they were sort of stuck on the new continent, and so they made the best of what they had.
Right. It takes tens of thousands of years. The Aborigines also have this incredible trip. All humans modern humans migrate out of Africa and up the African Rift Valley, essentially following food up the Nile River. You think of the Nile River as essentially the highway which humans use. Also, pre-humans also migrated north on that highway, following food, though pre-humans never made it to North and South America. However, they did make it to Asia. They have a fossil they call Java Man, who makes it to the Indonesian islands, and that's a pre-human. But all the bands migrate following game. They're hunter-gatherers. During the last ice age, again, they would be following the coastal path where there's fish and there's game, and they end up in North America. They have no awareness that they're crossing over. Now, we know there's human variability. I mean, just looking at us, you could see that we're not all the same. The variability amongst us is very minor genetically. I think they estimate that every one of us possesses 98% of the human genome, that it's only 2% that makes up any differences between us. And one of the reasons African Americans have such wide skin color is because in the Americas, there was sexual relationships, primarily, originally at least, between slaveholders and enslaved women. So we are one breeding population. Prior to 1500, we lived in localities, and there was not only on the fringes did people ever meet each other. And because of the nature of the human animal, when they met, they mated. Since 1500, there's been tremendous exchange. The transatlantic slave trade, the colonization by Europe of Asia and Africa and the Americas. So today, there's a lot more mixture than there was prior to 1500. I mean, what we call the Latino, the Latinx population of the Americas is overwhelmingly a mixture that comes out of the Spanish colonization, including European, indigenous, Indios, and African. The differences between us are very, very minor. The one that always stands out the most is skin color. And that's probably the most minor of all of them. One of the things that is interesting, if you look at the equator band around the globe, in all the different large population groups, the darkest people tend to live by the equator. And the lightest people tend to live at the extremes. A good example is Koreans are a lot lighter in skin color, skin tone, than Filipinos and Indonesians. Finns are much lighter than South Indians, yet they're part of the same Caucasian grouping. If you look at Africa, if you ever see pictures of Nelson Mandela, he is a much lighter African than the people who live in equatorial Nigeria. And one reason is because dark skin provides protection against skin cancers. On the other hand, dark skin blocks vitamin D. Well, in the equator, it's okay if it blocks vitamin D because there's a lot of sun. But in the northern and southern climes, you need the vitamin D because there's less sunlight. So people tend to be lighter. The hypothesis is twofold. One, that in the northern climes, lighter skinned people had a better chance to survive. In the equatorial climes, darker skinned people had a better chance to survive. So they passed along their genes to their descendants. The other explanation is cultural, that because in the equatorial region, it became clear to people that darker skinned people had a better chance to survive, parents may have favored darker skinned children. And in the northern and southern clime, because lighter skinned people had a better chance to survive, they may have favored lighter skin. But the reality is the differences are superficial. So dark skin, light skin evolves in all the groups along the equator. So when we migrate out of Africa, we are really fundamentally who we are. Evolution, change after that is on the most minimal level. Mr. Heilig, you're next. Now,
Right.
turn off your camera when you speak, because it'll be easier for us to hear, I think.
All right. Is it better?
Yes.
All right, I'm assuming so. All right, so let's start. So with chapter number 9, he goes into, I guess, the second reason, the reason I was going to talk about why the Mayans were behind a couple centuries compared to, well, the civilizations in the Fertile Crescent and all that. And that was a lack of proper draft animals. And so, big animals to do the work. So if you think back to the cows, pigs wars and first book we did, we talked about how the oxen, reason why cows are so sacred in India was because they produced the ox. And the ox, even in India today, is the equivalent of their tractor. And so, what Diamond hypothesizes is that if you look at the large draft animals that are actually domesticated by humans in the United States, so the horse, the cow, let's see, what's a couple other ones? But like the horse, the cow, those big animals that you can use to pull a plow, almost all of them are domesticated in Afro-Eurasia. Though the horse originates in North America, by the time human civilization develops, the original horse species had already died out in North America. And so, basically, they don't have any of the animals to work. So, like, for example, when Alan Singer says, why did it take so long for them to get there? Well, because they only had their own 2 feet to walk. Everything that they carried, or wanted to bring, they had to bring themselves. It's not like they can create the whole cart and use that to bring stuff back and forth. That's why I think, if I remember correctly, although I might just be just really sick at this point, which I kind of am, if you look at the original Mesoamerican societies, none of them invented the wheel, at least I think. And why? Well, true, it might have been very beneficial to have a cart that a human can just rickshaw around, pull a rickshaw like a proper wheelbarrow. But the reason why the wheel is especially invented is because in Afro-Eurasia, because they have the draft animals to really pull heavy loads properly with a cart or a buggy or a wagon. And let's see, just make sure we got enough time. Diamond basically goes around that again. I think we talked about this, how like you can't domesticate a zebra, even though people have tried, because zebras work differently from their distant cousins, the horses, and that the zebra, they are in the pack animal. They do whatever the heck you want. If you want to domesticate a zebra, you're going to have to domesticate every single one. Meanwhile, if you want to domesticate a horse, you just have to domesticate the first horse, the lead stallion. And once and that basically makes the human who does that the alpha horse. And so then you can basically bring the rest of the horse herd wherever you want it, and then domesticate it at your leisure. And so, yeah. And reason why they didn't really do it in, say, the Americas is because there aren't really any major draft animals that fit the criteria. So, for example, Diamond says, well, first off, it has to be an herbivore. While war bears sound nice in theory, if you think about it, it takes more resources to grow the grass, the feed, than feed it to a herbivore. The feed said herbivore to a war bear than it was to say, just feed the cow or even feed a horse. And so bears and other carnivores, for the most part, were not domesticated, unless, of course, they were specialized in certain niches. For example, the cat, again, we talked about. It was specialized to hunt the rodents. So it didn't eat the grain the humans liked. And for the most part, the cats that we did domesticate weren't big enough to eat the humans. And eventually wolves sort of became the same way. While wolf is dangerous, it's not, I'd say, on the same level as, say, like a lion or a tiger or bears, oh my. And so the wolf is also eventually domesticated. And then, of course, it has to be somewhat suitable to human habitation. So it's better that has herd dynamics. So that way it can be led around by the humans. It's easier for the humans to manipulate those herd animal bonds within the herd to get the animals to do what they want. Again, if you got the animals' kids and they care about the kids and you bring the kids along with you, well, the animals are probably going to follow if they're herd animals. Let's see, and I think those are some of the big ones. And then, of course, just time. And again, because the Afro-Eurasians had those staple crops that, they had a lot of food to go around, they also had the food to test things. So again, you can actually have the luxury of having the time to domesticate an animal over the thousands of years it took to domesticate horses, oxen, basically every single barnyard animal to become useful to humans because they had to spare food. And it does take a while. For example, the reason why in ancient warfare chariots were such a big deal was because there wasn't a horse big enough to actually hold the human being on it. However, though, by the time cavalry arises, a century or so later, we've selectively bred horses to actually be strong enough to hold the human rider. And so that kind of shows you how long it takes to bring an animal to be properly domesticated. And so, again, why did the Mesoamericans do it? Well, if you take a look at, the Mesoamerican civilizations, there was only one animal that they were able to domesticate. And I say that in the loosest term. And that was the alpaca or the llama in Peru, in the Inca Empire. Now, saying that they domesticated it, I mean, if you've ever met an alpaca or a llama at like a petting zoo, they're nice, but they're also proper assholes. They are not the most agreeable things in the world. They still have very much a wild mind of their own. And to make things worse, they're not very strong, so you can't really take an alpaca or a llama, attach a plow to it, and say, giddy up and plow a field. They chew my dress at the petting zoo. Exactly, they don't care. It's much the same way like we do work with cats. We don't control the cats. The llamas and the alpacas just happen to live with the humans because it's a little easier for them. But yeah, so basically they're not very good for pulling draft animals. They're good for, say, being shaved like sheep and also provide some meat. Not much meat, but it's better than nothing. And so it's not that the Mesoamericans didn't try to domesticate. It was that the very few animals that they could domesticate that were actually suitable to domestication without modern technology were all in Europe at this point. And the only one that might have been suitable was the horse, except the horse left America and died out there while it flourished in Afro-Eurasia. So, and that's basically sums up Diamond's Chapter 9, that basically human animal husbandry was more successful in Afro-Eurasia because they had animals there who met all the criteria to be domesticated by humans and actually be useful to humans at an exponential rate. And so it's a reason why you had all these civilizations in Afro-Eurasia being able to develop at a much faster rate than the Mesoamerican nations who had to do everything using their own 2 feet.
Okay. Well, before we discuss some of these things, Juliana, Victoria would like you to tell her about the movie Encanto. She hasn't seen it yet.
I loved it. I loved it so much. It was so good.
So
go ahead.
No, you go, Julie. No, you go. You go. It's so good, though. I had to say that.
It is.
Don't ruin it for me. Don't ruin it for me.
Okay, I won't tell you any details, but the representation of Colombian culture is great. I loved it. I am part Colombian, and I'm obsessed. The music, the storyline, it's great. You'll love it.
We have Disney Plus in my house, so I keep trying to get my family to watch it, but everybody's always like, no, there's football on, there's this on, so we haven't gotten there yet. But
so
it's on
what you do, you watch it by yourself because you're going to want to watch it 3 times more after. So watch it by yourself and then again with the family because you're just going to keep on watching it. It's so good.
My son makes me watch it every single day, and I watched it without him at least 5 times, and I still watch it with him every single day. Like, it's such a good movie.
Okay. Yes. Blade Runner is like that. Oh, okay. I want to just pull up a chart from Diamond. Okay. This is the Diamond's chart. And there are 14 species of big herbivores, meaning animals that eat plants that won't eat us. And the 5 main ones are sheep, goat, cow, pig, and horse. Sheep, their ancestors are from West Central Asia. The goat is from West Asia. Cow is Eurasia, North America. The pig is Eurasia and North Africa. And the horse is the Russian steppe. Now, though the horse survives on the Russian steppe, as Chris pointed out, the ancient horse was actually native to North America. And the original Native American migration across the Bering Strait basically ate them. The horse had no understanding of human hunters, and the camel had no understanding of human hunters. Some of them crossed the Bering Land Bridge going the older way, and they survived. But those that remained in North America, because they had no fear of the humans, were just eaten. He then talks about what he calls the 9 minor domestic species. The 2 different kinds of camels, the llama, alpaca, the donkey, the reindeer, the water buffalo, the yak, the Bali cattle, and the Mithan. But the point of this, again, is the only one in the Americas of all 14 is the llama alpaca. All of the others have to be brought to the Americas from Afro-Eurasia. The other point he makes is he looks at mammals. In Afro-Eurasia, there are 72 large mammals. They succeed in domesticating 13 of them, the ones we just saw, 18%. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are 51 large mammals. None of them were domesticated by the indigenous population. None of them has been domesticated by European farmers in the last 500 years either. They're not suited. And then in the Americas, there were 24 and only 1 was domesticated. In Australia, there was only 1 potential one. That was the kangaroo, was never domesticated. In North America, the camel and the horse do not survive the invasion of the indigenous population. The bison is a large mammal. You look at the bison and you say, well, why wasn't the bison domesticated? So let me stop the screen share. Why wasn't the North American bison domesticated? Okay, Jason.
I have 2 theories, I guess. The first one is similar to other animals that we talked about, like the hippopotamus, zebra, rhino. It was not conducive to being domesticated. And the second theory that I have is Native Americans did not domesticate animals in the ways that Europeans did. And they were the people who lived here first.
All right, but there's more to it though. Anyone else want to take a shot at it? Christopher.
I know, like the Native Americans, they hunted the bison, but they had the help of horses, but that didn't become available until much later. So I would think it's impossible to hunt the bison on foot because they're just too big, too fast, too aggressive, maybe. Or you can't, they're impossible to herd, and thus you can't really domesticate them, I would think.
Jenna?
I believe that the Native Americans were aware maybe of the idea that if they overused the bison, so if they're hunting them and now they're domesticating them, they may run out of wild bison. So,
There were a lot more bison than you could ever have eaten.
oh, okay. I
There
wasn't
were
sure because I know
millions-
that.
There were
they got-
millions of bison.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah. The herd stretched forever because they just ate grass on the Great Plains and there was nothing else, no other competitors. Mr. Hyland.
I'm gonna branch off and say, I think it was Jason. No, yeah. So basically, the reason why the indigenous peoples in North America never domesticated the bison is that, have you seen the bison herd? Look it up on YouTube. It's less, a bunch of animals going across something, and more like a bunch of freight trains traveling together over the land. They are a destructive force. And so, and actually, the Native Americans did hunt the bison before the advent of the horse. They just had to do it very less hunt and more sneak up on them. And they would actually use wolf pelts and sneak up on them or try to drag them off cliffs.
Right.
Which they still did.
If the
But
bison sensed that they were there, the bison would stampede and they would just run them over.
They're also very skittish.
Very skittish. If you go to the national parks where they still have bison, they do not get out of your car because if you scare it, it will attack.
So
it was funny. I think we were in Glacier National Park, or Bison, one of them, in Montana. We drove for 3 hours and we didn't see anything. Said, what a waste of time. And then all of a sudden we were in the middle of a bison herd and you saw how enormous they were and you said, we're not getting out of the car. Christopher.
But yeah.
Yeah, I know. Oh.
Sorry.
No, the other Christopher, Mr. Grau.
Okay. I know Diamond made reference to the fact that there have been zoos that have tried to domesticate bison, but still haven't, which I'm assuming then there must be more of a reason because of its size and ferocity when they're in herds. So it makes me think that maybe it's the same problem with the elephant, that it just took too long. It was inefficient.
Nikki?
I was just gonna say that, like, I went to it was either Nebraska or Iowa, and we went and did like a drive-through tour, and one of the animals that they had were bison or buffalo or whatever, and they're enormous. But just like you were saying, like, there were like none of them for a while, and then like we went through like the drive-through, and all of a sudden like there they were, and you were just like, oh, those are massive. Like, you don't want to like, it was an experience for sure.
Oh, that's why the New England Patriots are in danger in the football game this weekend because the Buffalo team is enormous. That was just a Jenna, you wanted to add something?
No, I never mind. I don't anymore. Forgot.
So,
but
yeah.
I thought of something, but Diamond didn't agree with it. But I forgot. Anyways.
If you think of it, you'll bring it back. The Native Americans were not able to effectively move into the Great Plains in significant numbers until they were able to capture Spanish horses. With Spanish horses, they could hunt the bison effectively, but on foot, it was just too dangerous. We have the next team, which is Ryan, Jason, Juliana, and Richard. Who's going first?
I'm going first.
Okay, who's going second?
Juliana, you were 11, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going second.
Jason is 12. Who's 13?
Me.
Me, Orion?
Yes, that's sorry.
That's okay. And Richard, you're 14?
Correct.
All right. Richard, again, we'll have to hear you. All right. Juliana, tell us about chapter 11.
So chapter 11 was all about germs and how germs affect us in many ways that I didn't even think of before reading this chapter. So it talks about like overall summary, how germs affect us from like live animals. Oh, great. This might be a little loud. Sorry, my dog. But it's gonna affect us through live animals, through food that we eat, like when we cook animals, as well as through other people when it spreads all the germs. So one of the big things he talks about, so first through live animals, he talked about how germs can spread all over through like bug bites or from our pets, like from rabies with dogs. So that's just some examples of like how live pets can spread these germs to us. Then he moves into how food can affect us, like if things are uncooked, which a lot of what he said reminded me of COVID, what we're going through right now. Because as we know, like I think we talked about it last class, that COVID was started by somebody in China who ate the bat, and it had disease in it already. So they're like any animals who already have virus spreading diseases, if we then consume that, it will cause us to also catch that disease, and then it will spread rapidly throughout all humans. So that was another way. And then it talked about germ spreading through people as well, meaning like he gave the example of pregnancy. If we as people, if you're carrying, if you already have something in you, like I think he said like AIDS, is one example that could pass through to your baby. And so that's like another way. So besides all these different ways that germs can spread to us, he also talked about germs from this point of view of a germ, meaning that he was saying like we see germs as something horrible, that it like destroys our life because people can die and we get sick and nobody likes that. But then he talks about how germs have this purpose and they're like living things, and how their goal in life is to spread as much as possible. And the way of doing that, the reason why germs love when they infect us is because it's so easy for us to spread the germs to other people, and germs just multiply. And at the end of the day, that is the goal of all these germs, is to just keep spreading and taking over. And that's how they like reproduce and like just carry on forever and ever. So that's what they do. And what was interesting was like we always focus on how many people can die from germs spreading, like viruses, like with COVID or like with the bubonic plague. But he says that the germ's goal is not to like kill us off, even though it seems like throughout history that's what it does, kill off a lot of people. That's not the end goal, because at the end of the day, if we all die, then germs have nobody else to keep spreading them. And that's what like was kept being reiterated, that germs need living organisms to live so that they can continue to spread to others. So that was interesting. And then as far as like how germs have impacted history, like it talked about like the Spanish conquistadors, when they came over to like the new countries and they invaded and like wiped out populations of like Native Americans. And it talked about like, well, how is this possible? Like, how did the Spanish spread their germs to the natives and the natives not spread their germs to them? And that was kind of like talking about immunity buildup, and how like the Spanish conquistadors have like all this immunity, like I guess because they were more civilized and they had like more exposures to different things, especially like probably them traveling all over themselves, where the Native Americans, like they were very closed off before people started traveling to where they live, so they didn't have the same type of exposure. So it's like when they came over, it's like all these new germs just hit them at once, and it's like too fast for their bodies to like react. So that's why they ended up getting wiped out, and many other people. And then what else did we talk about? And then going off of immunity, Diamond also talked about how we as humans are able to fight off germs. Like he gave the example of when we have a fever. Fevers are actually a good thing when you have them to get rid of germs, because our body temperature heating up kills the germs, because as many of you might know, germs do not live in hot temperatures. Like that's what kills germs off. So when we have a fever, that's our body reacting and fighting off so that we can get better. And with some germs, as we get better and we get over the sickness, those germs, that helps us to not get sick again. And that's how we build immunity. But this is not possible for all types of diseases, because there are some where we get sick, we get over it, now we're immune, we don't get it anymore. And then there are others where you can keep getting it again and again and again, like the flu, because the antigens in those germs keep multiplying like really fast, and they're constantly changing. So again, our body can't like keep up with them. So even if we get cured of one flu, it's like another form comes on. So that's why our body, we keep getting sick. So I talked about that as well. And then there's also generational immunity, where like as a society, as we all become immune and get vaccinated, how that helps us to overcome other diseases as well. Generationally, as like a human society, we just become more immune to certain things, which is cool. I was like, I thought that was interesting. And I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, this is a very technical chapter.
Yeah.
So I'm going to see if people have questions. We'll throw them to you, but then we'll throw them to the group, because there may be questions that, comments or questions about the points that Juliana raised. Hannah, go on.
I just like heard something interesting when she say, when your body have a fever, that's mean it's fighting the germs. Because my grandma always tell me when the babies have a fever, that's mean there is something wrong. They have infection, you need to do something. So I didn't thought that they are fighting the germs in the body. That's why they get the fever. That was new for me. So I always, when my babies have a fever, I feel like maybe they have ear infection, or maybe their throat is hurt or something wrong. But I never thought they are fighting the germs. That was new for me, actually. So thanks, Juliana.
Okay. Part of the issue here between your grandmother and Juliana is that we use germs, not genetically, generically. And we're really talking about two different disease-causing things. So what are the two different things that cause diseases in humans? Jason?
Viruses,
Yes. And the other?
bacteria.
Yes. Do you know the difference between a virus and a bacteria?
A virus is not alive.
What is it? Does anyone know what a virus is? A virus is a strand of RNA. It's a genetic strand that invades the cell and then tries to make the cell do its bidding. What is a bacteria? Go on, Jason.
Well, it's alive, right? That's why we have antibiotics, because antibiotic is bio alive. So that's why you can't take antibiotics for COVID, because it's a virus, not bacteria.
Bacteria are simple cell organisms that invade the body. Now, bacteria are what we fight by antibiotics and other medications. Bacteria will linger unless you take medication to get rid of them. Virus is what your body fights by its immune system. So that's we don't have. We have medicines that can help your body to defeat the virus, but that's the fever is your body fighting the virus. But if it's a bacterial infection, the fever is not going to stop it. So that's why we have two different approaches, because there are two different causes of the disease. COVID is a virus. Now, I guess the other question, Julia, why aren't we immune to the flu? Can you explain that better?
It said, I don't know if I can find the page, but
See, once you get chicken pox, you're not getting that virus again.
right,
But once you get the flu like every year.
right, because he said that there was different strands of flu. Like he said the antigens within the flu keeps changing constantly. So it's like if your body becomes immune to flu A, and then that's fine. You won't get flu A again, but there's also flu B, C, D, E, and like all these other ones that you can get that you're not immune to because they're different, even though they're all a part of like the flu in general. That's like how I understood it.
And what do you want to add to that?
Basically, what Juliana said, mutations, they mutate, and that's how they actually live. They actually mutate into other forms of itself.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing with the COVID, with the Omicron. We've had like 5 different waves, but they've identified over 20 different variants. And what happens is because it's just an RNA strand, it's a genetic strand, it's not an organism, it's constantly mutating, it's constantly changing. And the reason it mutates in viruses is that they replicate themselves by attaching onto nutrients in the cell. But if they attach is not exact, all of a sudden you have a different virus. And that's why in the flu, every year you have to get a flu shot, because every year you have to target the new RNA. Does anybody know why they were able to develop the COVID vaccine so quickly? It's important, especially as Ron Paul insults Andrew Fauci. Christina?
I mean, I'm not sure if this is what you're thinking of, but I had heard that they were already developing RNA vaccines, especially for AIDS.
Not just AIDS, but also for SARS, which had been another. But the reason they were able to adapt it is because they actually developed a new technique. So it wasn't just that they're able to use those vaccines, but they have a new technique that they developed. Does anyone know what they're able to do now? They basically developed a technique for cutting and splicing RNA on a microscopic level. And that's new. That's been the last 10 years. It was done as part of the AIDS research and as part of the SARS research, which is another respiratory disease. COVID is a SARS type virus. So they had already had the technique for making the vaccine. They just had to figure out how to do it right. And Anwar just posted it's SARS CoV-2. The difficulty they're having with COVID is the COVID virus is like a mushroom. And the part, I think they're able to develop the vaccine based on the cap, but they can't do it based on the stem. And the problem is it's the cap that keeps mutating. In order to have a long-term permanent vaccine, they have to have a vaccine that attaches to the stem. In smallpox, the vaccine attaches to the part that doesn't change. So that's why the smallpox vaccine is good forever. Chickenpox, again, measles, it attaches to the part that doesn't change. But in COVID, it's attaching to the part that does change, and the flu, it's attaching to the part that does change. Some scientists argue that essentially viruses and bacteria are the dominant species on Earth. We're their hosts. Hannah.
So Professor, you believe in COVID and you believe on the vaccine and everything.
Yes. The vaccine is very effective. I'm 72 years old. I had the booster in September before we went back to class for the protection. Even if Anthony Fauci is my hero. Even if it doesn't, if I get sick, I will not get as sick because I'm vaccinated. And I'm at an age, where if I get sick, I would be very dangerous. Couple of points that Juliana raised that are important. It's related to climate change. And that is, in mosquito transmitted viruses, the mosquito range is changing because of climate change. And there are two that have been a big threat recently: West Nile and Zika. The West Nile mosquito are now on Long Island because Long Island, New York used to be considered a temperate zone, and it's now in the semi-tropical zone, which means that the West Nile mosquito lives here. The Zika mosquito does not live here yet. But why is the Zika mosquito so scary? Jason?
Because doesn't it cause complications with pregnancy if you get Zika and then get pregnant?
This is what Juliana was saying. In general, a mother's immunity protects the fetus. However, the Zika virus, the mother does not have immunity, and it crosses the placental barrier with the mother's blood because the infant and the mother are tied together by the placenta. In early stage pregnancies, the Zika does tremendous damage to the fetus. And again, it is spreading because of changes in climate. Jason, you have the next chapter.
Okay. So this chapter is chapter 12, and it's titled Blueprints and Borrowed Letters. So it, like the rest of the chapters in this book, there was a lot. So I'm going to try to condense it. So just to say the most key points. So in this chapter, Diamond adds to his theory of geographic determinism through the examination of writing. And so for every society, well, first he starts off by saying that authors in the 19th century thought that history was a progression from savagery to civilization. So first you have groups who are not developed at all, and then civilization. And so all the transitions he talks about include the development of agriculture, which he already talks about, metal, which we, steal, complex technology, and centralized government, which was kind of in the food topic as well. But this chapter is about writing. So he addresses how all writing systems can be classified and under like three strategies. So the first one is alphabets, the alphabet, logograms, which is like Chinese, where you have symbols instead of like the Roman alphabet. And then you have syllabaries, which are like words or letters for syllables. So he gives the example of family. So for example, instead of having a letter, it would be like a letter that represents a syllable. So FA or MI or LY. And so he describes that there were only a few occasions, and now this is really interesting, a few occasions in history when people invented writing on their own. So he gives the examples of Sumerians of Mesopotamia and Native American societies in Mesoamerica. So one question that comes up a lot is, basically like why wasn't writing invented more often, or why didn't it come up sooner? And so he answers the question first about how writing spread across different civilizations. So basically there's two ideas: blueprint copying and idea diffusion. So to keep it simple, blueprint copying is looking at one alphabet and kind of almost copying it. So for example, the alphabet that we know today, like the Roman alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, came because it was a sequence of blueprint copying, which think about a blueprint and you copy it. And so then that's blueprint copying. And then idea diffusion is like the idea that, oh, there's this way that we can communicate written. So then one group will hear of it and say, okay, so now we'll come up like with our own. So for example, the one that Diamond gives in the book is a Cherokee Native American named Sequoyah wrote the Cherokee language after his interactions with Europeans who went to colonize the United States. And so what he did, originally he was a blacksmith. And so he already had a system where he would draw a picture of a person and like use circles and lines to show how much he was owed by them. And then when he came in contact with Europeans, he realized that there's a way to have a language. So he went ahead and sort of basing off English a little bit, created, I believe it has 85 letters originally. And so he was able to derive meaning from that in the way that he noticed that Europeans made marks on paper and derived meaning from that. So blueprint copying is just kind of like copying, and idea diffusion is to think of diffusion, like, in science, like it was diffused, like, oh, this group has writing. Okay, so now we're going to adopt that as well. And so similar to how he argues that agriculture spread on the east-west axis, that's a big thing that we talked about in the last class. He also contends that most societies obtain writing through interacting with other societies. So similar to how agriculture spread on that east-west axis, that's why he says that North Africa obtained writing from Mesopotamia. So the Middle East across to North Africa before other parts of Africa. So I think he gives the part of, I think he says West Africa. Well, why? It's because there's a desert in the middle. So if you think about that east-west axis argument that he gives throughout the whole book, and they're located on that line of latitude. So the main question that Diamond poses for the chapter is, why did writing arise and spread in some societies, but not to many others? So he describes that the reason is early scripts were incomplete, ambiguous, and that they had limited capabilities, limited uses and users. So you know how we talked about before, when groups were hunter-gatherers were able to settle and they were able to have job specialization. So one of those jobs we talked about, like priest, another one is a scribe. So scribes, people who wrote, used to be professional, like that was their job. And so written language writing was used by people almost in power. And so it was more of like a telegraphic shorthand when people were writing. So the example that he gives in the book is basically about how, I want to pull it up because it's really interesting. Okay, so he says in the oldest writing that he talks about is Sumerian writing, and it says in Sumerian writing, it would say John, 27 fat sheep. Now, if you hear those four words, like, doesn't make any sense, but that would mean we order John to deliver the 27 fat sheep he owes to the government to pay taxes. So that's why writing wasn't utilized as much. But then as it gets developed, it was used by kings and priests, by professional scribes. So they could say who owes taxes, keep track of things. And so that's why writing wasn't spread as fast as it could have been.
Couple of things, Jason. So symbolic writing. We have hieroglyphics in Egypt. We have cuneiform. We have Mayan. We have China. Where does the phonetic language come from? The writing, the system that we use.
So one point that Diamond makes is that many languages are a combination of all three, but wouldn't it be a combination between logograms and alphabet, but more alphabet?
But how come alphabet becomes dominant?
Because of the Romans?
Okay, one, the Greeks adopt the Phoenician system, and the Romans adopt the Greek system. But it's interesting, Egypt was evolving from a pictograph to a phonetic system, where each picture also was a sound. It never completed the process because when Egypt was conquered by Alexander, he just brought in the Phoenician system. But the Phoenician system was a system all across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians become the Carthaginians. But the symbolic, phonetic system is easier to learn than the pictograph system. Because the pictographs in China, I believe it's like there are 2,000 basic pictures that you have to memorize to be able to read a newspaper.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
But it's about 2,000, I think, and that's not even sophisticated.
I know that like my understanding of the way it goes in China is that like the kid, you know how like by the time we are all finished with like kindergarten or even preschool, like we've learned all the letters that there are in our language, in the English language. In China, that is not achieved until they are in like 8th or 9th grade.
Right. So it turns out that the phonetic system is just easier for mass literacy. One of the reasons that China does not change is because China has a very effective state system and bureaucracy. In China, literacy was not widespread. It was controlled by the state and its religious supporters. So they had no reason to change their system. They also, China, because of its, he argues because of its geography, but China is protected from the north by desert and from the west by mountain, by the south by jungle, and by the east by ocean. So China is relatively isolated, so it doesn't adapt, at least at that time. There's two languages that develop symbolic language. One is, Jason said, was Cherokee, the other is Korean. Korean also learned, instead of taking the Chinese blueprint, which is what Japan originally did, what Korea did is it learned about writing and created its own syllabic system. But that's both the, very much writing is embedded in a formation of the state. It's not just taxation. What else are states using writing to disseminate? Which is Hammurabi's code. Mr. Grau?
Well, laws, legal
Exactly.
principles.
Writing makes possible to have a legal system with laws that people must obey. The Hebraic Bible is not written down until hundreds of years after all these events happen, because it's then written in Aramaic, a Phoenician system, rather than an Egyptian system, which was in the region earlier. What language is the New Testament written in? Chris?
Isn't it in Latin?
No, not originally.
Greek or Hebrew? Greek?
It's originally written in Greek. And it's then, because Greek is the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. Rome is the lingua franca of the Western Mediterranean. It's originally written in Greek. The disciples were Greek speakers. But very much literacy is embedded in state formation. Literacy actually also spreads in other ways. West Africa has literacy before the arrival of Europeans. Does anybody know how literacy got to West Africa? with Islam. Islamic traders cross the Sahara, and they're trading essentially with the Kingdom of Mali for salt and gold. And they strike a deal. And the deal is that if the prince adopts Islam, they will then provide Islamic scholars. So Islam and literacy, the Quran, spread through West Africa. It is destroyed by European colonization, but it actually predates the arrival of Europeans. Now, well, literacy, China and Samaria, maybe Egypt and the Mayans, only develops 4 times. Pre-literacy develops in every civilized area. And that's the totem pole. That's the Navajo sand painting. That's efforts of people to essentially guide the story through images carved. So we see pre-literacy everywhere, but people only make the leap to literacy where there's state formation. And then once it develops there, it spreads out. Interestingly enough, Western Europe did not develop agriculture, it got it through diffusion. It did not develop literacy, it got it through diffusion. It did not develop metallurgy, it got it through diffusion. So one of the things that Diamond has to explain is if they never invented anything, how did they become the area that was dominant? Questions, comments? Ryan, we're up to you.
All right, so mine was titled Necessity's Mother. The entire chapter pretty much took a look at Diamond's views on how geography influenced technology and history of how we look at technology. He looks at history of what he calls like genius inventors, technological development, the reasons for technological development, and then why or how certain societies or fragments within those societies have different ranges of how they receive technology, how receptive they are to it, accepting they are of it, whether it lasts in certain societies longer than others. So he starts out looking at the history of, I can't even say this, Phaistos disc. It was believed to have been created in 1700 BC. So it's believed to be by far the earliest printed document in the world. It's a big circular plate-looking thing that has signs punched into it. It's made out of soft clay, and it was used to print documents using. Did they use ink in this? I'm not sure if they used ink or not. But it says that Diamond writes that this disc was anticipating humanity's next efforts at printing, but that didn't occur for over 2,000 years later in China and 3,000 years later in medieval Europe. So he uses this whole frame to question why was it used in Crete where the disc was and not elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, and why did it take 3,000 years for it to be used elsewhere? So he uses this to frame his first major argument, which is that there's a dominant narrative that says necessity is the mother of invention, along with the idea that there were genius inventors like Thomas Edison. The idea that necessity is the mother of invention states that inventions historically rise in response to an unfulfilled need. He does admit that while he's arguing against this idea, that there are some things that conform to this idea, like in 1942, the Manhattan Project was built with something in a purpose in mind, a need in mind. They wanted to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany did. Same thing with Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin to replace hand cleaning of grown cotton. He says that many or most inventions were developed by people driven by curiosity or by a love of tinkering in the absence of any initial demand for the product they had in mind. So he said once a device had been invented, it was on the inventor then to find an application for it that would work in society. One example he uses for this is Thomas Edison's phonograph. When he first invented it in 1877, he published an article, Edison, proposing 10 different uses for this invention. None of them ended up being what it was used for. Yet years later, to Edison's displeasure, other entrepreneurs had created jukeboxes by arranging for a phonograph to play and record popular music at the drop of a coin. And it took Edison about 20 years to acknowledge that his phonograph that he wanted to be used for many other purposes had just been used for recording and playing music. And he noted how Nicholas Otto invented the first gas engine in 1866, but it was 7 feet tall and effectively useless. So it wasn't until years later when someone else developed a smaller one, Gottfried Daimler, and created the first motorcycle and the first truck. So he says that there's an overstating of the importance of rare geniuses like Edison and Otto, and that inventors are often improving upon earlier works of other people. And then he goes to back that up, he goes to the story of James Watt, who invented the steam engine in 1769. However, Watt actually got the idea for his specific steam engine while repairing a model of Thomas Newcomen's steam engine that he invented 57 years earlier and had manufactured over 100 pieces of by that point. And Newcomen's engine had followed another person's, Thomas Savery's patented engine in 1698, which followed another steam engine that was designed in 1680, which had taken ideas from a Dutch scientist years earlier. So he just continues to go through the point that we talk about some of these people as rare geniuses that made these inventions that nobody had thought of, when in fact they'd been tinkering and developing with previous iterations of the same basic invention for decades earlier. He says that also that once inventions are built, they have to be accepted over time once they've found a purpose and a need, or a purpose is good. They have to be accepted by a society, and not every society accepts and receives technology and inventions in the same way. And if they're not accepted by the society, then they're effectively useless. He said there are 4 factors to society accepting new technology and inventions. The first was the relative economic advantage to existing technology. The second was the social value and the prestige associated with it. The third was the compatibility with society's vested interests. And fourth was the ability to physically see the advantages of the technology and invention. So if society and the average person couldn't see the advantages, they weren't likely to accept the new way of living or the new technology. And then he asks why in certain societies, because he looks at New Guinea and how different tribes, how one tribe in New Guinea, if he brought a helicopter down, would want to take a ride on the helicopter and fly it, and another tribe wouldn't care less and just go back to their business if a helicopter dropped down in the middle of their town, what they call it. And he lists 14 different factors, and I'm not going to go that he says explain why there's different groups of society. Like in America too, we have people that are less technologically advanced or less into technology than some of us, especially amongst some of the older population and in more rural areas. Not to generalize, but I guess I'm generalizing anyway. And then he finishes off by questioning how geographic location affects how readily different societies can receive technology especially from foreign areas, and whether those societies, based on their geography, can maintain technology and inventions, and also improve upon those inventions as society continues to develop over time. If a society can't maintain a certain piece of technology, it's bound to just fall by the wayside and eventually fade out and become obsolete, which then renders it effectively useless. So I know I kind of rambled a lot, but
Oh, it's okay.
that was a chapter in a nutshell.
Comments or questions? I have a somewhat different way of looking at it. I like to talk about packages, meaning there need to be a lot of factors in place for developments to take place. There are people of innovative intelligence all over the place. But unless they're in the right place and the right time with the right support services, it doesn't happen. There have been what we would call golden ages in different historical epics. Ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. But some of the better document is the Gupta Empire in India. China, about 800 AD, are golden ages. Islam has a golden age from about 1000 to about 1200. The European Renaissance would be a golden age. And what these golden ages have in common is that one, the development of urban centers. And in an urban center, people can exchange ideas. Two, they begin to organize schools. So ideas get taught systematically. Three, there's a surplus, so you could support intellectuals who aren't working. Four, there needs to be some form of literacy, because otherwise the ideas die with the individual. Five, there needs to be stability. There can't just be chaos. There needs to be rule of law. There needs to be protection. When these things are in place and there's affluence, you get the emergence of golden ages. And it's in golden ages that ideas exchange and you get these kind of developments. So I wouldn't attribute them to individual genius. And probably the best documented is the European Industrial Revolution. As Ryan pointed out, people have been tinkering with steam engines for hundreds of years. But in the Industrial Revolution, you had the coming together of capital, of industry, of technology, of government stability and government support in Great Britain. Ryan, do you know what the steam engine was originally developed to do?
No.
Does anybody know why they originally developed the steam engines? To pump water out of coal mines. Coal is a soft stone, so that water seeps through, so that the coal mines would flood. And what they did is with a piston, they pumped water out of the mines using steam engines. They then adapted steam engines during the Industrial Revolution to provide rotary power for factories. And then they readapted them for piston power for railroad. But what you had was this Industrial Revolution package, this golden age in Europe that made possible the adaptation of all these things. When Marconi invented the radio, 14 different people applied for patents on the radio. They couldn't figure out who really invented it. And you have the same phenomenon with with the telephone and with the Edison inventions. There are people experimenting with them, with the car, because you have all of the factors in place. So I've always argued it's the presence of the package that's more important than the individual genius. If you have the package in place, the geniuses will emerge because there always are going to be people who can do these things, but they may not be in a place where they can. I think the idea of a package is more consistent with the other ideas that Diamond has introduced than the idea of individual genius. Even today, you look at all the technological innovation, it's not one person. Steve Jobs didn't invent anything, he marketed it. Microsoft, what's his name?
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. What you had is a climate where there has been tremendous interaction and exchange globally. It wasn't individual geniuses that created computers. There were primitive computers in the 1940s. Alan Turing developed one to try to break the German code. But so it took a lot of people, but you needed essentially the tech package so that people could exchange things back and forth. I mean, this is ludicrous. We're having the class in the internet on mechanical devices. This did not exist 10 years ago. When I was in high school, we were not allowed to use calculators on the Regents exam. Do you know why? They hadn't invented them yet. That's how new some of this stuff is. I got my first computer. I was 32 years old, 1982. Now I think I'm getting it implanted to my head, so I don't have to use this. But again, the tech packages through exchange happen in, now what they're doing is they're happening globally. And that's a fundamental change because tech, email, internet is now a global phenomenon. Richard, we're up to you.
All right, can you hear me all right, or?
Richard, we'll hear you as best we can. Just don't go on too long because you're vibrating.
Okay. So in my chapter, the question that he kind of examines is how exactly big states and how civilizations form. Basically how, you know, humans went from being like small groups of people and into, you know, larger civilizations. So to do that, he kind of starts off and he talks about nomadic tribes in New Guinea and kind of shows how today, like they might be introduced to civilization and slowly they would, you know, learn the kind of more advanced ways of civilization that we have today. But then going off of this, he kind of discusses, you know, the kind of what a small group of people is, which is a band, right? And he says that bands are a small group of people that work together to survive. And he said that they're usually kept small for a number of reasons. One, obviously, is that they're living a nomadic lifestyle and they're constantly moving. So they have to stay small. But also, they also stay small because of due to diseases and also lack of resources. They're not even actually able to go into bigger groups, even if they wanted to. So it's believed that at some point in human history, all humans belong to different bands. However, humans did eventually evolve past this into what are known as tribes. And the reason that evolved past this is because of farming. So we no longer needed to hunt and gather in order to get food. And so we no longer needed to live a nomadic lifestyle. So tribes are bigger than bands. They're still pretty small, right? Bands are just a small group of people, where tribes might be, 100 or so people. So some differences between tribes and bands is that and one, the size, right? Like I said, tribes are bigger. And also in the tribe, people have different roles to play, right? So not everyone's going to be farming, right? Some people might be farming, some people might be hunting, might be gathering, right? Other people could be, building and making tools. Other, the woman might be taking care of children. So there's different roles to play, but there are similarities, and that's that decisions are made through discussion, whether it's a band or tribe, right? So there's no formal government or anything. It's just casual discussion to make different decisions. And wealth is pretty equal throughout a band and a tribe, and this is because people pretty much owe equal debts to each other because they're all doing a different part in order to help them survive. And then the big one is that tribes and bands, they lack bureaucracy, police force, taxes, and really any kind of government. So eventually tribes evolved into chiefdoms, and that's kind of that's like a big civilization, and was known as a state. So a chiefdom contains thousands of people, and this is more similar to what we see today. And so in these big states, right, there's two types of rulers or in government class, right? That can be a kleptocrat or a statesman. And different to the kleptocrat, if they're head of the government, they're really taking a lot of tribute and they're kind of using the success of the civilization for personal gain. Whereas a statesman, which is like what we have today, like you might describe President Joe Biden as a fantastic statesman. He's using the government and its taxes to build programs to go back into the society. So if the civilization is run by a kleptocrat, they have different ways to continue to control the people, right? And so in the book, he mentions 4 ways, which is to keep the people at ease. One, they can just simply disarm the populace and arm the elite kind of to protect their power. right? They could also redistribute wealth, which would kind of, keep the people at ease. They can also use monopoly to promote happiness, or one that I found really interesting was they could create an identity through religion. And so when reading this, it kind of brought me back to the conversation we had last week about Harris. When we were talking about Christianity and how the Romans kind of embraced Christianity because they felt that, that's a religion that their Messiah wasn't rebellious against the government necessarily. So I kind of do parallels there. But then again, the question is, so how did we get from these small groups of people to these larger civilizations? So the rest of the chapter goes through different theories, and some of them, Jean-Jacques Rousseau argues that states are formed because people realized it was within their self-interest to work together. So these different tribes would realize that, hey, rather than fighting against one another, we could actually work together, and that's how civilization was caused. But it's argued in the book that this is not the case, as many, small tribes are often taken by conquest. So that kind of contradicts the Rousseau. Another argument brought up that states are evolved around irrigation systems, which the idea of it is when tribes can create a good irrigation system, then a different tribes rejoin, but then that the first theory had, right? In order for a good irrigation system to be controlled by all these civilization.
Richard.
And then there's also the idea of food production, and that food production to a successful state. However, again, the question comes: does food production lead to a complex society, or does a complex society lead to better food production, or is it something kind of in the middle? And then, so the argument in the book is that amalgamation, or the joining of these different tribes, it happens either through the threat force or through force itself. And so that's really the argument that he goes through. He kind of argues against these other theories and said that if you look through history, most of the time, either small states join bigger states because, like the Roman Empire might have in them, and just either peacefully join our empire, or the other alternate is that it actually was taken by force.
Richard, it was hard for us to follow some of it. I know the problem is the tech stuff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think that's it. I hope you guys got it.
Right. Let me take people through some slides, and I can address some of the things that Richard said.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah. Richard, I'm going to show some slides. All right. These are just some response to some of the things that people raised. The animals provide human with work and with food, but they also provide us with disease. Now, the diseases can be devastating, but the diseases also meant that these civilizations that had the animals and had the diseases developed relative immunity. Measles is a cross-species disease, tuberculosis, and smallpox. They all are non-fatal diseases in cattle, but they are fatal in humans. But once you have immunity to them, they're not devastating to you anymore, but they are devastating to others. Flu, whooping cough, comes out of pigs, dogs, ducks. Malaria passes to humans from chickens and ducks. HIV to AIDS was originally a simian virus. Now, because monkeys had a shorter lifespan than humans, they just lived with it. because HIV/AIDS took a while to decimate the bodies. So monkeys that were infected with HIV/AIDS, they died of old age. We believe that the HIV/AIDS crosses the species barrier because people ate insufficiently cooked monkey meat. And that, so it was in the blood of the monkeys that was eaten, crosses into humans. COVID crosses over from bats. Now, some diseases do not cross directly from one animal to humans. For example, the bubonic plague was a complex disease, meaning the pathogen lived in rats. But rats don't exchange blood with humans. We don't eat them. However, fleas that bit the rats would also bite humans. And it was the fleas that transmitted the bubonic plague from the rats to the humans. The bubonic plague spreads through Europe in devastating fashion in the 14th century, and which is also the time of the start of what we call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling in Europe. And it may well be that because of that cooling that was taking place, humans and rats were living in greater proximity to each other. So it was easier for the fleas to jump from one to the other. This is a language map from the book. And again, you have Sumer, Mesoamerica, China, and Egypt probably developed writing independently. Based on that, the Phoenicians, Ethiopians, Koreans, Rome, Greece, and maybe Ireland developed somewhat independently an alphabetical system. Crete, Japan and Korea and Cherokee developed this symbolic system. This is the disc that I think Ryan was talking about, but they never developed a system for printing off of it. This is the Korean symbolic print. So each of these symbols does not represent a sound, and it doesn't represent a picture, but it represents a complex sound. And then the Cherokee alphabet, again, is very similar. Okay, this is what Richard was talking about. Again, it's not his fault. Diamond makes the point that there are basically 4 types of human societies: the band, the tribe, the chieftain, and the state. And he defines them by the number of people in the group and other relationships that develop. So the band is basically a society of a couple of dozen people. It's nomadic, and the people are directly related to each other. They're kin. It's a biological unit. Usually it's a father, his male offspring, and their women. They have one language because they're only talking to each other. They tend to be egalitarian, meaning they make the decisions informally and collectively. They share. They don't really own anything. They don't have a surplus. And that would be a band society. Tribes tend to run in the hundreds. they become a village, they become agricultural. Tribes are called clans rather than kinship. What that means is there's a belief that we're kin, that we share ancestors, but that's nebulous. People can join the clan and have symbolic kinship. They tend to be one language. They start to have, while they're still egalitarian, they start to have leaders. Food production on agriculture is the primary function, and they now control the land on which they live. Chieftains are the next stage in cultural development. We're looking at populations in the thousands, maybe 1 to 10,000. There are multiple villages. Families or kin may have separate residents. You start developing class structure. You still tend to have only one language, one ethnicity, but leadership tends to be hereditary. The son of the chief becomes chief. The chief makes decisions. The chief also is the judicial conflict resolution person. And the chief start having assistants who help the chief, maybe a war council. So you start getting what we call administration, and you start getting more and more a standard religious belief. You get the division of labor. People specialize in different things, and the chief may own the land rather than the collective. In chiefdoms, you start having slavery, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Diamond argues that state formation develops populations are now over 50,000. Significant, intense populations, many villages, defined class structure, and you may even start to get multiple ethnicities and languages. I'm not sure about that. Usually, multiple ethnicities and languages we would call an empire, and those would tend to be very large states. Decision-making becomes centralized. It may be one person or it may be a collective class that makes decisions, but you definitely have class formation. Power is monopolized by the upper class. They control the law. They control judicial decisions. They control the church, and you get the partnership in the state of the church and state. You now have taxation. The taxation may be in the form of labor, it may be in the form of products, or it may even be in the form of money. And you start getting what they would call large-scale enslavement. So Diamond is arguing that as population grows, people move through these stages. All people do not necessarily change. Some groups remain in bands. Some groups never move beyond tribes. Some groups never move beyond the chieftain status. In West Africa, most of the populations end up in that chieftain status. Native Americans most remain in tribal bands. In the Arctic, they remain bands, and in the Amazon, in more severe climates. State formation we see in Rome, we see in Greece, we see amongst the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Inca, in Mali, and in different African tribes, in China. In empires, we see in Rome, Greece, China, Inca. One of the things that I find most interesting here is the debate over slavery. Because Diamond argues he never really discusses slavery, but he says there's small-scale slavery in chiefdom and there's large-scale slavery in states. And I radically disagree with him. I think that Diamond is using the same word to describe different things. And that is a problem. The historian Robin Blackburn argues that we call slavery only, he makes a distinction between a society with slaves and a slave society. Ancient Greece and Rome were slave societies. More than half of the population were enslaved. In Athens, it was 70%. In slave societies, the work is done, the productive labor is done by enslaved people. They generate the wealth. Societies with slavery is something quite different. If you think of West Africa, in tribes and in chieftains, there are people who commit crimes. There are people who are conquered in war. What do you do with them? There are people who are impoverished. What do you do with them? I mean, in advanced societies, you lock them up and throw them in jail. But these societies don't have jails. They could kill them. But instead, what they do is they invent a system of bondage where the person does not lose their status as a human being, where it's temporary, and where their children do not inherit their status. As a matter of fact, they can intermarry with the tribe. So these societies have a system of bondage, but it's not what we mean by slavery. What we call slavery is what happens in the Americas. It's chattel slavery, and that develops as part of capitalism. In chattel slavery, people lose their status as human beings. They become chattel, non-human. Their status is inherited by their children. They have no rights. They have no responsibilities that must be respected. And they are the main labor source for the production of goods. In the Caribbean, it was sugar. In North America, it was cotton. In South America, it was minerals. Robin Blackburn argues that only 4 places develop this kind of slave system. Rome, Greece, 3 places, and the Americas under European conquest. So I think Diamond is using the word slavery where he means bondage. And he never really addresses anywhere in the book the transatlantic slave trade, other than to talk about his population exchange. Thoughts, questions, comments? We're going to save the last chapter for Monday. What I was going to, we have about 15 minutes. So I want to introduce you to our second museum trip, which is the Cloisters. Has anybody here been to the Cloisters in Manhattan? Okay. This is worth a visit. What happens is during the French Revolution, the church was part of the state in the ancient regime. They were the first estate, nobles were the second estate, and they were the largest landholders under feudalism. the peasants sacked the church estates and the revolutionary government redivided the lands. The monasteries fell into decay. In the 1930s, the Rockefeller family, which funded the Metropolitan Museum of Art, decided to bring ruins of monasteries from Spain and France and rebuild them in Washington, Fort Tryon Park in Manhattan, just north of the George Washington Bridge. So the Rockefellers bought all the ruins, and they were reconstructed by WPA work programs. So if you go to them, you're actually visiting reconstructed medieval cloisters and monasteries. Now, you can't even touch the walls because some of the walls are actually the stone that was brought. Now, other pieces, they have to build, just so it's in that skeleton, there were pieces of bone and pieces of plaster. In the cloisters, you have the same thing. You have original stuff and then modern construction that it fits into. Let me show you some slides of the cloisters. One of the reasons I like to visit the cloisters is it helps us to understand that Christianity is also an adaptation to the world in which people lived. So when I take student groups, we look at these questions: the role of religion in medieval society. How is it expressed through European art? How are transformations expressed in the religious art and architecture? What symbolisms do they discover in the medieval tapestry? Does the Holy Spirit reside in the artifacts? In traditional societies, the Holy Spirit, the animist societies, resides in their idols. I argue that in Christianity it does as well. How do medieval institutions legitimize social structure? And then the last question is, what is the difference between art and craft? So if you look at the Pyrenees, the cloisters that are rebuilt come from both just north and south of the Pyrenees. And one of the reasons they come from that area is there's a very famous pilgrimage trail called Santiago de Compostela. And I think I mentioned it. I actually did the last stretch from Ponferrada to Santiago. But I also did a stretch in the French Grand Massif on a different trip. One of the things that's striking about some of the medieval cathedrals, this is the Catholic cathedral in Cordoba, Spain. And it was originally an Islamic mosque that becomes a Catholic cathedral. And the way we know is that these arches with narrow supports about 6 feet apart, that's the Islamic style. This is a Roman arch at the cloisters. And just at the top piece, that's called the keystone. Everything rests is held together by the keystone. This style was developed by ancient Rome. This is a Roman aqueduct that still stands in Segovia, Spain. It is immense and was used to transport water. The key again is the capstone So the weight all presses in on that middle capstone. The capstone arches are incredibly heavy, and the walls are very, very heavy. The Islamic arches are much more refined and much narrower. In the 13th century, the architecture changes and they develop what they call the Gothic arch. The Gothic arch, you'll notice at the top, does not have a capstone. The Gothic arch is much more svelte. The walls are much thinner, and it's easier to construct. The cloisters has both Gothic and Romanesque arches. This is Notre Dame of Paris before it had its devastating fire. And this is a Gothic cathedral. If you look at the entry points, you'll see that the entrances are Gothic. There's no capstone. This is a scene from the cloisters. One of the advantages of the Gothic cathedral is that you can have larger windows of glass because the walls are not as heavy. And what we have here, and one of the things that happens in the Gothic cathedrals is that one of the ways they are able to convince the peasantry that this is God's will, if you go there, as the light streams through the windows from the outside, it is a symbolic, but it's an actual representation of God's grace. These are the stained glass windows from Chartres in France. They're the most famous, most complex stained glass ever created by the church. And one of the things that's interesting, when the Nazis were bombing France, the church actually took the glass apart piece by piece and kept detailed records so they could rebuild it after, and they packed it away in straw. The tiny pieces of glass are held together by lead. In the cloisters, they have tombs. And one of the things that's interesting about the tombs is there are shiny parts because people would kiss them. And when you touch them, hoping to get blessings from the dead, you left your oils from your skin on them and caused deterioration. The nobility would be buried in their esophaguses, partly to demonstrate their power continues after they go to heaven. And what you have is their pets, their dogs primarily, be buried with them. This is a chapel, the main chapel in the cloister. This was a Romanesque chapel. Can you look at the archway? And with a Jesus in the center. If you look at the windows here, the windows are narrow on the outside, wide on the inside. Why would the windows be narrow on the outside and wide on the inside? It's because the cathedrals were also fortifications. Narrow on the outside meant it was hard to shoot an arrow in. Wide on the inside meant it was easy to shoot an arrow out. And the doors were metal inlaid oak. So in case of invasion, people could be herded inside the castle to be safe, the cathedral or the castle. The cloisters were also trading centers because the monks were the literate ones. So they were not only you didn't go for prayer, but you also went to buy and sell. I mean, the Stations of the Cross are an example of pre-literacy. Peasants are illiterate. What did the Stations of the Cross tell? Someone must know. Christopher?
Is it the process of Jesus being crucified and rising from the dead? Or is it his entire
Starts
life?
with his invasion of Jerusalem. So the Stations of the Cross tell the New Testament stories through pictures because people were not literate. It is a example of pre-literacy. You start getting what they call illuminated manuscripts, which have both words and images. One of the interesting things is Ireland, during the invasions of the Germanic tribes, becomes a place where the skill of creating these elaborate illuminated manuscripts survives. And some of the best ones are in Dublin. The art also tells a story. This is St. Roch. And if you look at his left leg where his hand is, you'll see he has a giant cyst that's dark. This is the cyst of bubonic plague. It's also called black plague because the pus is black. And once the pus is there, it means you're dying. The cloisters have one of the most famous medieval tapestries, and they're the unicorn tapestries. And the unicorn tapestries are both tell the story of Jesus and his crucifixion. Jesus is the unicorn, but they are also have a practical function. The castles leak water and they're cold. And these very elaborate tapestries would be used to hold in the heat and keep out the damp. We look at it as works of great art, but they were actually very practical in use. One of the amazing things is there's actually a unicorn horn they have preserved there. And people believe these were unicorn horns, which is why they believe Does anybody know what it actually is? Because there aren't any unicorns. It's a narwhal tusk. But they when they would wash ashore, people believed they were unicorns. One of the things is up until the European Renaissance, the art of the Eastern and the Western Church is very similar. It is symbolic art. People are not drawn the way they are. And what you have, for example, is the Jesus is a little man and Mary is a mature woman. Does anybody know how old Mary was when she bore the baby Jesus? Approximately. She was most likely 13. She just started menstruating. Now, a lot of the Catholic art also tells the story of Jesus and Mary. This is Jesus holding the baby, and that's Mary, the Pietà, that's Mary holding the dead Jesus. In the European Renaissance, you get the transformation of Jesus and Mary. On the left, you have Mary as a mature woman. On the right, you have Mary as a 13-year-old. On the left, you have Jesus as a little man. And on the right, you have Jesus as a baby. One of the things that's interesting is in the Renaissance, they continued to tell their religious stories. This is the angel Gabriel going to see Mary to tell her she's going to bear the Son of God. But if you look in the background, what do you notice hanging on the wall? Jason, what's on the wall?
Hold on, let me enlarge the.
Oh, what's on the wall in the back? It's large enough.
Is it a mezuzah? I can't see. It's like really small on your screen.
Oh, let me see if I can make it bigger. Sorry. You should have told me earlier.
Oh.
Is that big? Is that a little bigger?
Click the what is it called? The green button in the top left, or that works. Oh, the talus.
It's a talus.
Oh, I was like, what are you?
Why did they have a talus in the medieval story of the ancient Gabriel speaking to Mary?
Because the people were Jewish.
Right. Anyway, so I try to use a visit to the cloisters. So we examine Christianity and how it adapts to its world and environment in the same way as other religious beliefs do. I don't teach religion. I teach the history of religion and the role it played in societies. Any last question, thoughts, or comments? Okay, for people, okay, before I call it, for people who are student teaching, I got the permission letters that you need to get students to sign, because even though we're not doing TPA, we're going to be doing filming. Okay, Tiffany, what's your question?
I know you said that we were taking a final. Next week is our last week of classes. When would we be reviewing what's going to be on the final?
That's what we do every day.
Oh, okay.
The final is going to be questions about the books.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, and we'll continue with Diamond on Monday, and then on Tuesday, Tiffany is going to take us through the book Teaching Climate History, and I'll do some filling. And then on Thursday, we'll discuss Linden, and then in the last half of the class will be the test. I don't give tricky tests. There'll be multiple choice, and it'll only be on things we talked about. People who had me in other classes, the class, it's the things we talked about, it'll be multiple choice. And then there's an opinion essay, which will give you a chance to kind of summarize your thoughts. Other questions, other thoughts? Okay, I'm going to close it down. Stay if you need to talk to me. Otherwise, we're not meeting tomorrow, right?
No, we are not. It's Friday.
TGIF. I actually deserve a couple of days off. I have to read your papers. Get your papers in. I'm going to be reading them tomorrow. All right. Have a nice weekend, everybody. Stay safe and careful. I'll see you on Monday.
Have a nice professor.
I'm not. Wait, Jason. I'm not.
All right, I'm waiting.
Chris, how are you feeling?
Well, I'm feeling better. Bad news is I had one of those home tests and I got the Rona. So
wait. Are you have corona? You have COVID?
I think so. Pretty sure.
All right. So just take it easy and isolate. You don't want to make your mother sick.
Here's the problem. I got it from her.
Oh, then hell with her.
Yeah. So that was fun. I'm still isolated now, being careful because my dad might get it. So.
All right. Just take it easy.
Careful. I know I am. So it's weird too. I originally thought it was a stomach bug, but no. Yeah.
Well,
I wouldn't recommend it.
No. All right. You'll get. Take it easy. I'll see you on Monday.
Hopefully
All right,
so.
If you're going to be delayed with the paper, it's okay. I understand.
All right. Thank you. Excuse me. I gotta go throw up.
Joseph, what do you need?